When you consider the vast amount of information about the Earth that's encoded into the Great Pyramid, you can't just dismiss all of this as pure coincidence.
And then, when we take precession into account, you find something else very intriguing happening. First of all, you find that the exact orientation of the pyramids, as it is today, and pretty much as it was when they're supposed to have been built 4,500 years ago.
For generations, the Great Pyramid of Giza has been presented as the glorious peak of Egyptian civilization, the ultimate masterpiece built after centuries of learning and practice. But researcher Graham Hancock points to a disturbing and illogical truth hidden in plain sight. The timeline of progress is completely backwards, instead of getting better. The pyramids that came after Giza are dramatically worse, many now just crumbling piles of rubble, as if the master architects had vanished and left behind apprentices who could only make poor copies. How does a civilization forget its greatest skill overnight? Why is the very first version of a technology the best it ever gets, with every later attempt being a failure? What if the real story of Giza is not one of Egyptian inventions, but of an inheritance they could see, but never truly understand? The promise of progress, the story of ancient Egypt, as it is told in museums and history books all over the world, is a story about learning and improvement over a very long time. We are taught that the Egyptian civilization started small and, through many generations, became smarter, stronger, and more skilled. This idea is called progress, and it is the promise that history makes to us, showing how people can build upon the knowledge of those who came before them. In the beginning, the Egyptian kings, called pharaohs, were buried in simple mud brick tombs. Then, over hundreds of years, their architects learned how to work with stone, building the first smaller, stepped pyramids, and with each new king, or each new dynasty, which were the powerful ruling families, their skills were supposed to have grown. The final result of all this learning, the greatest achievement at the very peak of their knowledge, was the creation of the magnificent and perfect Great Pyramid of Giza. But a researcher and author named Graham Hancock has spent 3 decades looking at this promise of progress and has declared that the physical evidence tells a completely different and shocking story. He does not look at the official history books. Instead, he looks directly at the stone pyramids themselves. And what he sees is not a story of progress, but a story of a sudden and impossible decline. Hancock claims that the timeline of pyramid building in Egypt is completely backwards, and it goes against all logic and common sense. He does not ask the usual question of how the Egyptians managed to build such a masterpiece at Giza. He asks a much more disturbing question. How did they reach a level of absolute perfection only to immediately forget everything they had just learned? This mystery is the key to unlocking the entire secret of who really built the pyramids. Graham Hancock argues that the evidence is not hidden in some ancient text, but it is written in the quality of the stones and the engineering of the buildings themselves. He suggests we look not at what the Egyptians built at Giza, but at what they tried and failed to build afterwards. To understand this incredible story of lost technology, we must first go back to the supposed masterpiece itself, the Great Pyramid, and look closely at the evidence connecting it to its official owner. The problem, as we will see, is that the evidence is not just weak, it is almost completely missing. The ownerless legacy, the entire official story that we are told about Egyptian progress, rests completely on one single, very important idea. The idea that the Great Pyramid of Giza was built to be the final tomb for the pharaoh Khufu. According to this timeline, all the smaller, less perfect pyramids came first, and they represented the long years of learning, while the Great Pyramid was the final result, the magnificent graduation project of an entire civilization. For this story to be true, the connection between Khufu and the pyramid must be solid. absolute and undeniable. But when we look at the actual evidence with a critical eye, as Graham Hancock has done, the connection begins to fall apart, and the magnificent legacy starts to look like a building without a true owner. The first major problem is the complete lack of traditional royal decorations inside the pyramid in ancient Egypt. A pharaoh's tomb was a sacred and busy place, and its walls were always covered in complex art and writing. These decorations, which included picture writing called hieroglyphs, were not just for show. They were a necessary technology to help the king's soul navigate the dangerous journey of the afterlife. We can see this in every other major royal tomb found in Egypt. The walls are filled with spells, prayers, and images of the gods. Yet, the interior of the Great Pyramid is the complete opposite of this. Its long passages and high chambers are made of perfectly cut but completely blank stone, and there is not a single official hieroglyph carved anywhere on its main interior walls to praise Khufu or to guide his soul. This strange and silent emptiness is the first great clue that the building's original purpose was something very different from a tomb. The second problem is the granite box, or sarcophagus, found inside the main king's chamber. This box was supposed to hold the mummy of the king, but it is also completely blank and undecorated, with no name or royal title on it. When it was found, it was empty, and no trace of a body or any burial treasures has ever been discovered anywhere inside the Great Pyramid. The common explanation is that tomb robbers stole everything thousands of years ago. But this does not explain why they would also remove every single carving and inscription from the walls. This leads us to the final and most controversial piece of evidence. The only thing that directly links Khufu to the pyramid is a series of crude, red paint marks found in some small, sealed chambers high above the king's chamber. These marks, which look like a worker's graffiti, were only discovered in 1837 when a British explorer named Colonel Howard Vyse used gunpowder to blast his way into these hidden rooms. For Graham Hancock, it is unbelievable that the ownership of the greatest building on Earth is based only on some questionable paint marks, found in a hidden space, instead of a grand, official inscription on the main walls for all to see. This lack of evidence leads Hancock to propose a different theory that explains all of these problems perfectly. What if the pharaoh Khufu and his dynasty did not build the Great Pyramid at all, but instead, they were the first people to find it, already ancient and standing silently on the plateau? This theory suggests that the Egyptians were not the original architects, but only the inheritors of an ownerless legacy. The most powerful evidence for this incredible idea is not found by looking deeper inside the Great Pyramid, but by looking at the disastrous and crumbling pyramids that the later pharaohs tried and failed to build in its shadow, the flawed copies. If the Egyptian pharaohs of the 4th dynasty, the time of Khufu, were the inheritors and not the inventors of the Giza pyramids, then we should be able to see what happened when they, and the kings who came after them, tried to build their own pyramids from scratch. The historical and archaeological evidence is absolutely clear on this point, and it provides the strongest proof for Graham Hancock's theory. The story of what came after Giza is not a story of continued success. It is a story of dramatic and catastrophic failure. The pyramids built by the later pharaohs of the 5th and 6th dynasties are not just a little bit worse than Giza's. They are so poorly constructed that many of them today are barely recognizable as pyramids at all, and they now look more like sad, crumbling hills of sand and rubble. A perfect example of this can be found at another ancient site called Sakkara. The pyramid built there for a pharaoh named Userkaf was much smaller than the Great Pyramid, and its core was not made of massive, perfectly fitted limestone blocks. Instead, it was mostly built from rough, crudely shaped stones, with the empty spaces filled in with rubble and sand. As a result, once its outer casing stones were removed, The entire structure basically collapsed in on itself. Another later pharaoh named Unas also built a pyramid at Sakkara. And while it is famous for having the first religious texts written on the inside walls, the building itself is also a structural failure compared to Giza. It is clear that the knowledge of how to build a massive and stable pyramid that could last for thousands of years was simply gone. This presents a problem that goes against all logic. Why would a civilization that had just perfected the most incredible building technique in human history suddenly choose to forget it and start building in a much cheaper and weaker way? It is like a group of people who have learned how to build a strong, modern skyscraper suddenly deciding that their next project will be a small hut made of mud and sticks. Graham Hancock argues that this was not a choice at all. It was a necessity. The pharaohs of the later dynasties were like people who had found a beautiful, high-performance car. They could admire it, they could use it, and they could claim it as their own. But they did not have the blueprints, the tools, or the scientific knowledge to build another one just like it. All they could do was try to make flawed copies using the simpler technology they actually possessed. This failure to copy the overall size and stability of the Giza pyramids is obvious to anyone who visits these other sites. But the loss of knowledge becomes even more shocking when we look at the specific, super hard materials that the original builders were able to shape as if it were soft clay. The granite problem. The failure of the later pharaohs to build pyramids as large and as stable as the ones at Giza is a major clue. But the mystery becomes even deeper when we look at the specific materials that the original builders used. The main body of the Great Pyramid is made from millions of large limestone blocks. But for the most important internal chambers, like the King's Chamber, the builders chose to use a much more difficult material, a super hard, crystalline rock called granite. This was not a random choice, because granite is one of the strongest and most durable natural materials on Earth, and it is also one of the most difficult to cut and shape. The official story tells us that the ancient Egyptians cut these massive granite blocks using only simple hand tools, like soft copper chisels and heavy, rounded pounding stones made of a rock called dolerite. But when modern engineers look at the evidence left behind on the stone, they see something that does not make any sense at all. Inside the King's Chamber, the surfaces of the granite walls and the granite sarcophagus are incredibly flat and smooth. The corners of the sarcophagus are perfectly square, cut with a precision that is extremely difficult to achieve even with modern power tools. Copper is a very soft metal, and it is simply not hard enough to cut through granite in this way. It would be like trying to saw through a thick piece of steel using a knife made of hard plastic. An engineer named Christopher Dunn has spent many years studying these granite objects, and he has found evidence that is even more puzzling. He has pointed out marks on the stones that look like they were made by very powerful, high-speed drills, and he has shown how some of the granite boxes have perfectly carved inside corners that hand tools could not have possibly made. The evidence, he says, suggests that the original builders had some form of advanced machining technology that has been lost to history. This brings us back to the most important question of all. What did the later pharaohs do? If the Egyptians of Khufu's time had truly mastered this incredible technology for working with granite, then the later kings should have used it too. But the opposite is true. In the later, crumbling pyramids, the use of precision-cut granite is much, much rarer. The later builders almost always chose to work with the much softer limestone, which was easier to shape with their simpler tools. This is another powerful piece of evidence showing a loss of knowledge. The original builders could shape granite as if it were no problem, while the later Egyptians seem to have avoided it whenever they could. The inability to work with this super hard stone is another proof that they were not the inventors of the technology they were trying to copy. This forces us to ask a very old question. And to find the answer, we must look at a different kind of clue. A clue that was not carved by man, but was carved by the weather itself over a very, very long time. The water's trace. The evidence of the crumbling pyramids and the problem with the hard granite strongly suggests that the Egyptian dynasties were working with a technology they did not invent, a technology that was much older. But how much older could it be? To find a possible answer to this question, we must leave the pyramids for a moment and look at the other giant. Mysterious monument on the Giza Plateau, the Great Sphinx. The Sphinx is an enormous statue with the body of a lion and the head of a human, and it was carved out of a single, solid piece of the natural limestone bedrock. The official story says that the Sphinx was created by the pharaoh Khafre, the same king who built the second largest pyramid at Giza, which would make the statue about 4,500 years old. For a very long time, this was the accepted history. But in the 1990s, a scientist looked at the Sphinx with a completely different kind of eye. This scientist was Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist, who is an expert who studies rocks and how they are changed by the earth and the weather over very long periods of time. He was not interested in the art or the history of the Sphinx. He was only interested in the story that the stone itself had to tell. When he looked closely at the body of the Sphinx and at the steep walls of the rocky pit, or enclosure, that it sits inside of, he saw something that was completely out of place. He saw deep, vertical channels and grooves running from the top to the bottom of the rock. He immediately recognized these marks as the classic signs of water erosion, the kind of damage that is caused when heavy rain falls on a piece of stone for thousands of years. The rain slowly dissolves the rock and carries it away, creating these deep, vertical patterns. The problem with this discovery is a very big one. The Giza Plateau is in the middle of a desert, and it has been an extremely dry place with very little rain for at least the last 5,000 years. The wind and the sand in a desert can also cause erosion, but wind erosion creates a very different pattern. It looks like horizontal bands and smooth, rounded surfaces, not deep. Vertical grooves. Dr. Schoch concluded that the only way the Sphinx could have these marks on its body is if it had been sitting there during a time when the climate in that part of the world was much wetter, with regular, heavy rainfall. The last time that this region had a climate like that was at the end of the last Great Ice Age, more than 7,000 years before the time of the pharaohs. This geological evidence suggests that the Sphinx is not 4,500 years old, but could be 12,000 years old, or even older. This places a highly advanced, giant stone monument right in the middle of a time when history tells us there should have been only simple hunter-gatherers. And if the Sphinx is that old, then who were the people who had the skill and the organization to create it? The portrait of generation. 0. The water erosion on the Sphinx points to a single, shocking conclusion: that a sophisticated civilization was building massive stone monuments at Giza thousands of years before the first Egyptian pharaohs. This ancient date of more than 12,000 years ago places these mysterious builders in a time period at the very end of the last ice age. Graham Hancock does not believe these people were aliens. He believes they were an incredibly advanced human civilization that has been completely forgotten by history. He calls this lost civilization Generation 0, because they were the original architects, the first masters of a technology and a science that has almost completely vanished from the world. This was the generation that learned how to build with enormous stones, how to cut hard granite with precision, and how to create monuments that could last for ages. So where did this advanced civilization go? Hancock, along with a growing number of other scientists, believes that Generation 0 was almost completely wiped out by a series of terrible global catastrophes that happened between 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. Geologists have now found evidence all over the world for this period of intense disaster, a time of massive floods, rapid climate change, and evidence that suggests pieces of a comet may have hit the Earth. This catastrophic event would have destroyed cities, erased coastlines, and thrown the entire world into a dark age, ending the advanced civilization of the Ice Age. But a few people survived, and these survivors were like the keepers of a sacred flame of knowledge from their lost world. In the centuries and millennia that followed the disaster, these small groups of survivors traveled the world, passing on fragments of their advanced knowledge to the more primitive hunter-gatherer tribes that also survived. We can see the fingerprints of this lost knowledge in many places. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, another massive and highly complex stone temple has been found that is also more than 11,000 years old. Ancient myths from cultures all over the planet, from the Andes Mountains in South America to ancient India, tell almost the exact same story. They speak of wise, godlike teachers who arrived by sea after a great flood and taught their ancestors the basics of civilization, like how to farm, how to track the stars, and how to build with stone. The portrait that emerges is not of pharaohs inventing pyramids, but of pharaohs discovering the last, great monuments of Generation Zero, a civilization that was the true, and now forgotten, parent of all later civilizations. And if this story is true, then we must ask why this powerful and logical idea is so fiercely rejected by the gatekeepers of our official history. The battle for the legacy, the evidence for an older, lost civilization that created the Giza monuments seems clear and logical. It explains the impossible beginning, the sudden decline, the problem with granite, and the ancient age of the Sphinx. So why is this idea not taught in universities and accepted by the majority of Egyptologists and archaeologists? Graham Hancock argues that the reason is not about science. It is about protecting a story that has been the foundation of our understanding of history for more than a century. The modern field of Egyptology was built on the idea that the ancient Egyptians were the sole inventors of their incredible civilization, and that the Giza pyramids are their greatest, most original achievement. This idea is a source of immense pride, not just for the field of Egyptology, but for the entire nation of Egypt as well. To suggest that the Egyptians were not the original architects, but were instead the inheritors of an even older legacy, is seen as a direct attack on this foundation. If Hancock's theory is true, it means that the pharaohs were not the genius inventors, but were more like respectful caretakers, or even failed students, of an older and greater knowledge. This would completely change the role of the ancient Egyptians in world history, and it would force a complete rewriting of the first chapter of human civilization. For many in the academic world, this is a change that is simply too big and too disruptive to accept. It is easier to attack the new evidence and the new theories than it is to admit that the entire accepted story might be wrong. This battle for the legacy of who built the pyramids can be seen in how new, strange discoveries at Giza are handled. When evidence is found that fits the official story, it is celebrated and shared with the world. But when evidence is found that challenges the story, it is often dismissed, downplayed, or quietly ignored. Hancock believes that the fierce resistance to his ideas is a way of protecting a legacy, the legacy of the Egyptologists and historians themselves, who have built their entire careers on the old story. The argument is no longer just about stones and dates. It has become a struggle for control over who has the right to tell the story of our collective human past. And in this struggle, the stones themselves have been trying to tell their story all along. A story that leads to a final, and surprisingly respectful, conclusion about the relationship between the pharaohs and the monuments they found. The legacy of failure. So we arrive at the final, logical conclusion of this great mystery. The answer to our big question, why the history of pyramid building in Egypt goes backwards, is now clear. The ancient Egyptians did not invent the technology to build the Great Pyramid. They discovered it. They were like a person from a forgotten tribe walking out of a jungle and finding the ruins of a silent, modern city. They could see the magnificent buildings. They could touch the strong materials. And they could feel the incredible power and intelligence of the people who had come before them. But they did not have the science or the blueprints to understand how it was all done. They were not the authors of this great work. They were its first readers, and they were filled with a sense of awe and respect. The pharaohs of the Fourth Dynasty, like Khufu and Khafra, were powerful kings, and it was only natural for them to claim these godlike structures for themselves, to use them as their own sacred sites and burial grounds. And in the generations that followed, the later pharaohs wanted to have their own magnificent pyramids. Just like the ancient ones at Giza, this is where the story of failure becomes so important. Every crumbling, poorly built pyramid that came after Giza is not a sign of the Egyptians' weakness. Instead, it is the most powerful evidence we have for the greatness of Generation Zero. Every failed attempt to copy the original masterpiece is actually a form of praise. It is a silent admission from the later pharaohs that they could not match the work of the ancient masters. The final proof that Graham Hancock presents is not a new, secret artifact, but a new way of looking at the evidence we have always had. The legacy of failure is the key. The fact that the Egyptians' skills went backwards is the ultimate proof that they were trying to copy something they could not understand. The pyramids they built themselves, with their own simpler technology, were their honest and best effort to pay respect to the perfect monuments that already stood on their land. So, in a strange and beautiful way, the official story is not completely wrong. The ancient Egyptians are still a vital part of the pyramid's history, not as their builders, but as their first students and their most dedicated guardians. The greatest evidence that proves the Egyptians did not build the Great Pyramid is, ironically, all of the other pyramids that they did.